Hello and welcome to Run Testers. My name's Nick and this is our full review of the Hoka Rocket X3. So the Hoka Rocket X3 is a new carbon plate racing shoe that replaces the Rocket X2 in the Hoka lineup and joins the Cielo X1 2.0 in that lineup as one of two carbon plate super shoes available from Hoka. It's cheaper than Cielo X1 2.0 and the same price as the Rocket X2, costing £220 or $250. It's lighter than the Rocket X2 and the Cielo X1 2.0. According to my scales anyway, it weighs in at 208 grams or 7.3 ounces in a UK size 9. And it's got a 7mm drop from heel to toe, which is 2mm higher than the drop on the Rocket X2. So Hoka's made quite a few changes to this shoe, and in general the role of the Rocket has changed compared to the Cielo. So with the Rocket X2 and the Cielo X1, the Rocket X2 was the lighter shoe, it was seemingly the faster shoe, the more aggressively race-ready shoe, whereas the Cielo X1 was very big, comfortable, supportive, bouncy, pretty stable. It was a really great fast training shoe and maybe marathon shoe, but didn't feel quite as racy as the Rocket X2. Then things have flipped a little bit with the latest versions of the shoes. With the Cielo X1 2.0, you've got a really lightweight, very aggressively rocker design, pretty unstable design all round. It's really now pushed as a very fast, speed-focused carbon plate racing shoe compared to the more rounded maybe design of the Cielo X1, whereas Hoka is pushing the Rocket X3 as a more supportive and stable carbon plate racing shoe, so almost filling in what the Hoka Cielo X1 did for lots of people. So it's an interesting change of approach. With that in mind, we were very interested to test out the Rocket X3 and see what it could offer runners as maybe a slightly different carbon plate racing shoe. You got a single layer warp knit upper on the shoe with pretty minimal padding around the tongue and collar as you'd expect. There is an internal heel counter on the shoe, but it's fairly flexible, so offering support without being really rigid or anything like that. You have a dual density Pima midsole with a carbon plate running through the middle of that with a wing on the lateral side of the shoe. You've also got the sidewalls of foam, which are part of what Hoka calls its active foot frame, to basically almost cradle the foot at the back there and add some support and stability. You also don't have loads of cutouts on the Rocket X3, which helps with stability. I mean, there are pretty big cutouts, but they're in the middle of the shoe rather than on the medial side in particular, which is what you have on the Cielo X1 2.0, which is why it can feel a bit unstable for lots of runners. Don't have that so much with the Rocket X3. Then you've got a sticky rubber outsole with good coverage on the forefoot and heel, kind of the usual outsole configuration for a carbon plate running shoe these days.
In testing, I ran in a UK and a half, that's a US 9.5, which is my regular size in Hoka shoes, though I do sometimes find that Hoka come up somewhat snug, but for a race fit or fast trainer fit, I don't mind a bit of that hugging. With the Rocket X3, I'd say there's good length in the toe box, okay length in the toe box at least, and clearance-wise, I was generally happy. Midfoot lockdown was okay for me, though I did have some looseness and slipping in the heels, which I could fix if I paid particular attention to how I laced in, but I definitely had to do that. And sometimes I found I had to stop during the run to sort of retie and to get that locked down really kind of nice and snug. Now, some shoes I can just whack on and run in, but I did have to pay a bit more attention. However, overall, I think in generally kind of roominess and overall fit, I would still recommend going true to size. Going half a size down isn't going to fix that heel problem.
Comes to fit of the Rocket X3, it was all good for me in my normal running shoe size, the same size I used across the Hoka range, including with the Cielo X1 2.0 and the Rocket X2. I've got enough room at the front of the shoe, enough width for me. I do have a fairly narrow foot, which is why I do get on with Hoka shoes, because they can be a bit narrow at times, but I don't think the Rocket X3 is aggressively narrow, so I think it should be okay for lots of people. And in general, yeah, had a very comfortable fit, no problems with it. I would stick to your normal running shoe size. On to the run test, and I've done about 60 kilometers of running in the Hoka Rocket X3 ahead of its launch today. I've been using it for a mix of hard workouts on the road and the track so far, along with a fair bit of easy running to and from those workouts. I was a reasonable fan of the Hoka Rocket X2, I would say. I think it was a carbon plate shoe that got lost a bit in the crowd for me, but had a lightweight, pretty comfortable, pretty propulsive design. Like, I've run my 10k PB in that shoe. It certainly had the performance, but it wasn't necessarily one that I would pick out of the carbon plate bunch for myself anyway. I have been a pretty big fan of the Cielo line so far, though. The X1 was a very comfortable and stable, bouncy carbon plate shoe that I use for a lot of marathon training in particular. Did race in it a couple of times, but thought it was a bit heavy. The Cielo X1 2.0, much more aggressive, lighter. I've raced a couple of times in that shoe. Really like that one as well. And then the Rocket X1, I actually also really like, and I think it actually has characteristics from all of Hoka's other racing shoes so far, and it's a shoe I think will work really well for lots of runners who maybe don't get on very well with very aggressively rockered or unstable super shoes. You've got a more supportive option here in the Hoka Rocket X3 that might not be as flat out fast as the best shoes on the market, I'd say, but does add that little bit of comfort and, like I say, a bit of its stability, especially around the heel, that might work well for lots of runners. I think it's important not to underplay its speed though. It is still very lightweight, and it does have a very fast and punchy ride from the combination of foams in the midsole and that carbon plate. It rolls through pretty smoothly. It's not as aggressive a rocker as the one on the Cielo X1 2.0, which has a firmer feel and really pushes you from the midfoot onto the forefoot. Got a slightly smoother feeling here with the Hoka Rocket X3, but it does still turn over pretty quick, and you are getting a nice amount of bounce from the foams. So I have taken this shoe down the track and done like some flat out stuff, like my fastest 400 meter session in years, where I was running I think 20 times 400, alternating 70 seconds, 80 seconds, and yeah, it has got that lightweight pickup you need to go and do those short, sharp intervals. I've also done some short, fast stuff on the road in it, and it does feel really light on the foot. But then you have got enough kind of support and bounce there to hold your pace well in those longer reps as well. I've done 2k and 2 mile reps in the shoe at around marathon pace and half marathon pace. Again, feels nice and comfortable, feels nice and cruisy. Don't think, like I say, you're getting the really punchy turnover you get from some shoes like the Cielo X1 2.0 or the Puma Fast R3, where you've got really sharp rockers that really throw you forward. I do think they make them slightly faster, I think, than the Rocket X3, but the Rocket X3 does have another string to its bow in how sportive it is, and it is pretty stable. Like, I don't want to overstate how stable it is. Like, it's still pretty soft, high stack carbon plate super shoe. You are still going to get a little bit of rolling inward and that kind of thing if you're worried about that, but it is quite supportive around the heel. It doesn't have those really punchy medial side cutouts you have on the Cielo X1 2.0, so I do think it is a more supportive option, and it is pretty comfortable. So when I'm using it for warm-ups and cool-downs on tired legs, it feels pretty comfortable. Longer runs as well, I think if you're looking at this as a marathon option, it will be a really strong option for lots of people because it isn't as wildly unstable as some shoes, has a slightly more natural ride, a more comfortable ride, while still being lightweight and having a lot of kind of punch from all the tech in the midsole. So there's definitely a lot I like about the shoe, especially as one you can use for a lot of training as well. Obviously see how durability holds up, but it's definitely a shoe you can just take out and run on pretty normal roads. You don't just have to be in those pristine race conditions on good roads with no traffic to really get the most out of the shoe, because it isn't too dodgy underfoot when you're running on slightly broken pavements or cambered pavements, that kind of thing. I've even run on a canal towpath and it's completely fine, and I think it is a little bit more relaxed and comfortable than lots of carbon shoes while still being fast. Like, it brings to mind something like the Diadora Gara Carbon 2, which also quite a smooth, comfortable carbon shoe, but this is quite a lot lighter than the Diadora and cheaper as well. So I think if you're just thinking about flat out speed, the more aggressive, efficient rides of things like the Puma Fast R3 do come to mind ahead of this shoe. But there's a lot to like about this, and over longer distances like the marathons, I think lots of people might benefit more from its more supportive design.
So in testing, I've done close to 30 miles in the Hoka Rocket X3. That includes everything from a progression run, moving from easy pace up to close to 5k pace, to some cruising 10Ks that I did, and some miles at a very easy clip. All of that pretty much has been on the road. I also recently went to Helsinki with Huawei, and I had only this shoe in my suitcase, so I was kind of really interested to see how versatile it would be to handle the runs that I did out there over 3 days. Could it handle everything? Well, it pretty much did, and that's the kind of interesting point about the shoe. Some changes here I like. I much prefer the new non-gusseted setup for the tongues that felt a bit narrow and restricted to me when I put them on. I found it a bit of a struggle to get them on and sitting comfortably in the Rocket X2. The free tongue, I think, makes it easier to do that, to get my high-end steps into the shoe. That has improved. I also prefer the traditional padding and the extra heel counter support that you get here in the Hoka Rocket X3. Even though I did have some slipping, once I was in place and locked in, I think that really helped with the comfort compared to the Rocket X2, which were a bit more minimal racy, and I felt like they're a bit more risky over the distance. I found the single layer uppers nicely breathable in some big heat that we've been running here in the UK. Then when it comes to the ride, I enjoyed moving in the Rocket X3 right across the pace range. I get a smooth kind of clip-along transition from the combination of the rocker and the plate and that kind of soft P-buff foam that you've got. The landings are soft, but not too soft and wobbly. There's some reliability underfoot and a consistency, I think, in the platform that gives you the confidence to run more freely, unlike some other carbon race shoes that we've seen recently, where you might have to focus a little bit more on foot strike, including the Cielo X1 2. The Rocket X3 sort of fades a little more into the background and lets you get on with business, which I like. I found there was good protection from the dual density stack over longer time on feet. I did it like a 90 minutes. What you also get is a kind of easy rolling propulsion, I think, that helps you out of each foot strike with some energy. That all makes the Rocket X3 feel smooth and fast but controlled. I still find the Rocket X3 quite accommodating at my slower paces as well, or for my slightly more loose and ragged, easy run form. I still think it looks after me quite nicely. It's certainly better than the Cielo X1 2 at the lower and slower end of things. That shoe kind of demands that you move with sort of your top pace intent. On the flip side, the Rocket X3 isn't the fastest feeling carbon shoe. It's not a slouch, and it does give you back when you're running with intent, but I wouldn't put it at the top of the carbon shoe pile for that all-out performance. Now, I think I would sort of say the Rocket X3 maybe slides in between the sort of Mac X2 from Hoka and the Cielo X1 2, though it does sort of raise the question a little bit for me in my mind, do I need the Mac X2 and the Rocket X3? My gut says I probably use those shoes for largely the same kinds of runs, though maybe the Rocket X3 offers some extra softness for sort of longer miles, and maybe over a marathon sort of race distance it would be a better shoe for some runners particularly. I had no complaints about grip, but only really ran in the dry. Sometimes I felt like I wasn't 100% on the platform in terms of sitting on there when cornering. I sort of felt like I was coming off slightly, but I've experienced worse than that. The Adidas Prime X2 Strung, for example. On durability, from the miles I've done so far, everything seems to be holding up well. No troubling signs of wear on the outsoles or the uppers or in the heel collars. Verdict then, and the promise from Hoka with the Rocket X3 is that you've got a shoe that delivers speed, long haul comfort and race day stability, and I actually think it hits those notes pretty well. Overall, I enjoyed my test miles in the Rocket X3. It's certainly a competent carbon shoe with a big dollop of versatility. It's definitely a more controlled ride than the Cielo X1 2, which for me now sort of tops Hoka's lineup as the punchiest out and out carbon race shoe, but can be a bit wild. I'd choose the Cielo from Hoka's lineup to go chasing my PBs over everything up to the half marathon. But if the Cielo X1 2 is too aggressive, a little bit too unstable, too wild, then I think the Rocket X3 serves up a smoother, more reliable ride that I think may suit more runners over the longer distances. It could be a good kind of hedge your bets marathon race shoe. Now, the Rocket X3 is springy, efficient and lively, but I think it offers a comparatively stable platform for a super shoe. It's not entirely stable, but compared to some of the other shoes, it's pretty good. I found it had a good pace range versatility, but I wouldn't put it in the same sort of fast racing bracket as shoes like the Metaspeed Sky Paris or the Puma Fast R3. Then finally, if we're talking about the runs I'd use it for, to me it felt a bit more in the ballpark of a Saucony Endorphin Speed 5 or a sort of Mac X2. It would cover those same sorts of faster training runs in my kind of rotation. Then it wouldn't sort of replace some of the very best carbon race shoes. But if you are looking for a faster plated trainer that can step up to race day as well, I think it's certainly got those credentials covered.
Verdict on the Rocket X3. I think this was a slightly surprising addition to the Hoka range, and it's going to take a little bit of rethinking how you look at shoes like the Cielo and the Rocket lineup, because they've kind of flipped in position here. I think it's a really nice option all round though, and I do think it's going to work really well for lots of runners. Maybe not necessarily people who absolutely love the Rocket X2, because I think you've got a slightly different feeling here. I think they had a slightly more aggressive ride, the Rocket X2, even though it was a bit heavier. I think you've got a comfortable shoe here that still does move you forward well, gives you lots of bounce, is still fast, but maybe isn't aiming for that all-out aggression of shoes like the Cielo X1 2.0 with those really punchy rockers and cutouts. And I actually think if you're a big fan of the Hoka Cielo X1 and then were a bit worried about the Cielo X1 2.0 when it came out because of the lack of stability in that shoe, the Rocket X1 might suit you really nicely. It isn't as big and wide and bouncy as the Cielo X1 was, but it is a more stable option than the Cielo X1 2.0 for sure. So I'm generally someone who is always chasing the fastest times and looking at the most aggressive racing shoes. So something like the Puma Fast R3 suits me down to the ground, or looking at shoes like the Asics Metaspeed line up, but there's definitely a case for looking at this slightly more comfortable shoe like this. It reminds me a bit of something like the Adios Pro 4 as well, which is still lightweight, bouncy, but doesn't feel quite as punchy as some shoes. It's a little bit tamer than the Adidas as well, but also a little bit more supportive without cutouts and stuff like that on it. So there's a lot of reasons that I'd want to have this shoe in my lineup as a carbon plate racer that I'd be able to do a lot of training in, use for some B races, especially on maybe when the terrain's not maybe quite as reliable as when you're going to a big city marathon. But there are obviously super trainers that can kind of fulfill that role as well for less than the Rocket X3. So I don't think it's a shoe that I'd say is a must-have or anything like that, or a top recommendation. It's a shoe I've loved really running in. I think it's got a lot of uses, will work for lots of runners, and if you are put off by shoes like the Cielo X1 2.0 or the Puma for just being not quite supportive enough for you, then I think you'll have a better option here in the Rocket X3. Like I say, I don't want to go too far on the stability front. It's still very much a soft, high-stack shoe, so it's not going to be the most supportive, but yeah, all around I think it's one that lots of people will benefit from checking out. But if you are someone like me who's just chasing all-out speed with your racing shoe, it probably wouldn't be my go-to option. That's our review of the Hoka Rocket X3. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, ring the little bell, and we'll see you next time.